Good evening. I am a grateful recovering alcoholic, and my name is Richard, and I'm pleased to be here tonight. And uh, Stephen has sort of cut off a little bit of what I might have started out with here because I wanted to acknowledge that I was here tonight because of Stephen and our friendship over these many, many years. I think we started going to meetings together in the mid 1990s when we were both engaged in helping lawyers stay sober. And um, I formed a real solid bond. And we used to, when I first got sober, my first sponsor said to me, he said, you're going to be doing this for the rest of your life. So you ought to figure out how to make it fun. And Stephen's somebody that knows how to do that. Stephen has led me into places where I, as he said, would not have been, but for being in his company, because I had an experience yesterday, not yesterday, but Sunday, flying back from New Orleans, where I had a lively seatmate who viewed himself as quite the conversationalist and engaged me in talks about everything in the world. And at some point, we got around to me saying something about being part of the Black bourgeoisie, and his head snapped back. And he said, "You're Black?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Black." And that called for a little rewind on a number of things, but it reminds me tonight that maybe I ought to say that just so there isn't any doubt. I also had an experience speaking at one of the conferences that Stephen and I used to go to, in which I got done speaking, and a fellow from the audience suggested that he was astonished that I considered myself that. And I ended up telling him, "Let me tell you, you raised two Black young men. You're going to be Black. And you're going to relate to society from that perspective." And I was raised as a young Black man, and that turns out to be part of my story. It's a part of my story that I tend to be a little bit sensitive about, because I'm about this being about not drinking and not being about a whole bunch of socioeconomic, political issues. But I've had to confront and face up to over time that a number of things in my life related to that divide have had to do with, if not my alcoholism itself, but with some of the consequences. And so I'm going to start off and try and tell my story. Haven't really been doing it much lately. Back when I first got sober, it was a better habit. It was a shorter story, and it had greater impact to me in that regard. I was going to point out that, Stephen and I have been traveling this happy road of destiny for, well, it's moving towards 30 years. And I met him at the American Bar Association meetings that are of Alcoholics Anonymous, that are held at their annual and mid-year meetings. And I got to those meetings shortly. I got sober in 1994 when I was president of the Boston Bar Association, which is the oldest bar association in the Northern Hemisphere. And I started to go to those meetings when I went to the ABA meetings, and I was astonished at how spiritual these lawyers were that I would meet at these meetings. And I'd go to a meeting and one guy would say some profound thing, and then it would go on, pass on to the next guy, and he would say something that was even more profound. And so it went. And I got back to Boston. I went to my sponsor, who is also was a high-ranking lawyer, and I said, "I don't understand this. I don't know whether the meetings are so good because they're lawyers, or I can't tell you what it is." And he didn't tell me what it was, but I think we sort of sussed it out, because they weren't lawyers. They were 12-steppers. They were 12-stepping lawyers, But the essence of their participation in those meetings was that they were there on a mission to help other suffering alcoholics. And by its very nature, that selection process identified people who were connected spiritually. And so I view myself as blessed for having the last 28 years of practicing my Alcoholics Anonymous, a group of men and women who were dedicated to helping others. And you all know that Stephen Todd is certainly first amongst those sorts. And I find it a privilege to be his friend. And let me start to tell you my story. And I always go by the, what happened, what is it like, what happened, and what's it like now. But I got to start with what happened. And in 1994, I was scheduled to take office as president of the Boston Bar Association, which I told you we quarrel with Philadelphia over which of us is the oldest bar association in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's a good, funny fight, but it still tells you something about how long it's been around. But I had for years been worried about taking over that job because I had been having trouble with alcohol. I had gotten to that place where I couldn't be clear where a drink would take me. And of course, I hadn't read the book yet, so I didn't know that that was just part of the deal. And that once you got to that place, you were one of us. But I didn't know it, but I knew that I had a problem and that I couldn't take on this responsibility. And I'd done a few things about it. I'd talked to my personal physician about it, and he sent me to a addictions specialist, so-called. And I went to him for, I think 3 months, and we went through all kinds of drills and didn't drink before X time in the day. We didn't drink for 3 days. We didn't do this. We didn't do that. And at the end of that process, he said, I don't think you're an alcoholic. I think you're a problem drinker. And I said, well, as my sponsor used to jokingly said, I got another 3 years out of that one. And he told me that when I wasn't drinking, it was like I was holding my breath, but that I could hold my breath very well. And as a swimmer and as a scuba diver, I was quite proud of holding my breath. So that gave me a little bit time more to do that. And different things like this. I went to one of my partners, walked down the hall, and I sat across from his desk, and I said, I'm kind of worried about my drinking. And he told me straight away that if I was even worried about my drinking, I was going to be okay. And that was a sign that I was going to not have that problem. And well, that fellow, by the time I got into the program, was the managing partner of my firm. And so I got to call him from treatment and tell him that I was now addressing that problem, which he didn't feel I had. And we went on, and I continued to practice law. And and finally, at one point, I was confronted by my older boy, my older son. He came home for Mother's Day, and the two of us had conspired to get him. He was in boarding school, to get him home and surprise his mother. Well, we did that, and that was all grand. But that Sunday morning, he surprised me and confronted me on my drinking. And he told me that he didn't like the way I treated his mother and his brother when I was drinking. And I told him straight away I would stop drinking. And I did. I stopped drinking for about 2 years. And his little brother joined him at that boarding school, and my wife and I were home alone, and there really wasn't much tension in the house. But there came a time when somebody offered me a drink over lunch or something, and before I knew it, I was drinking just like I'd been drinking before. And I couldn't blame it on conflict or anything else. It was just what I was doing. So I still kept moving along and promising myself I'm just going to have a couple of drinks, promising myself that I got a big meeting tomorrow, so I shouldn't drink, doing things which were designed to have me in control. And then gradually I found that I wasn't in control. And I often say that I couldn't stop drinking till I couldn't stop drinking. And I think that that may be true for many others in our situation. My life at that point had become the joyless discharge of duties. I was doing what I was supposed to when I was supposed to do it, but there was no joy in it. There was no happiness in it, and I didn't know what was wrong. And I mentioned earlier the ethnic connection. I had grown up in a situation where my father, who came to this country from Trinidad at age 13, had gone to night school and gone to college at night and ultimately gone to medical school, and he was a practicing physician. But he told me, never contend with the majority community for something that you want if you think they may want it. Don't take that risk. And I managed to make my way through life without engaging in those conflicts. But you know what? I found the way to deal with it. When I started to have a conflict with someone and I could see it coming on, I would make my way out of it. I would use my language skills to de-escalate it. And then I would go home and I would have a drink. And after the second drink, I would have convinced myself that had I had that argument, I'd have won. And that it became not only the way I muted the effect of the stress, but it was a way that I preserved my own sense of worth, of being better than others. And that went on, and it went on. But at some point, I got on the ladder, we call it in the bar world, to being president of that bar association, which meant I was going to be secretary one year. I was going to be treasurer one year. I was going to be vice president. And ultimately, I was going to be president. So it's triggered well in advance. And I started moving towards that space. And I went off to bar president school, and I got groomed, and I did all these things. I look at some of the videos from bar president school today, and the glassy-eyed look. And does anybody know that? Well, I had that in spades, and I'm not proud of who I was, but I was still getting by. And I was scheduled to take office in September 1994. And come the spring of 1994, the executive director of my association said, hey, we got to get going on this. And so I called a meeting of the leadership of the Bar Association, and I was supposed to, at this meeting, map out what I was going to do during my year as bar leader. And I had the meeting on a Monday night, and I carefully arranged to have wine and cheese at the function so I could top off my chemicals and I could maintain my equilibrium. And let's suffice it to say, we had the meeting and it got done. But that's all it did, was I got through the meeting. I didn't really have much to say, and I didn't have much of a plan. I had just decided I was going to get done with this tour, which was supposed to be the highlight of my professional career. I got done that night, went home, showed up at my office the next morning at the usual 7 o'clock in the morning after having been to the gym, because I had to do something to fight the effects of what I was doing to myself. And the phone rang somewhere between 7 and 8. And it was the fellow who was going to follow me as president of the bar. He was a partner at the firm most directly competitive to mine, in the city of Boston, and he called me and he said, "What are you doing this morning?" And I said, "I'm just going to be working around the office." And he said, "Do you mind if I come over?" And I said, "No, come on over." And I knew he knew. I knew the jig was up. And he went down from the 31st floor in number 60 State Street, crossed the street to number 53 State, and came up to the 28th floor. And I met him in our lobby. We walked down to my office, walked into my office, looking out over the Charles River. And he said, I guess he said hello, but the next thing out of his mouth was, "That was a pretty shitty meeting last night." And my response to that was, "I know." And then he said, and I think you may have a problem. And I've often described that he used some pluperfect subjunctive sentence, which essentially called me a drunk. But, and then he said, "And I think you can use some help." And when I said I know to that, I often say that may have been the moment that the grace of God returned to my life. Because I was not a helpee, I was a helper. I was a doer, I was a caretaker, I was a caregiver, not a care receiver. And he suggested that I call his partner, the man who ultimately ended up being my early term, first 10 years of sobriety sponsor until his death. But I called him the next day and he said, "Come on over and have lunch." And I went to their law firm and I sat in their cafeteria after having gotten a half a cup of coffee while he had filled a tray. And I sat with him. And he might as well have said, "I hear you're having a problem with booze, Bubby." But he may not have used those exact words. But he substantively said that to me. And I said, yes. And it was that famous stick a fork in him time. I was done. And he suggested that they had a better way and invited me to go see the woman who at the time was the executive director of our state's Lawyers Concern for Lawyers. And when I speak, and I speak mostly to professional organizations, but when I speak elsewhere, I am very proud to say that we try and look after each other, that we have an organized bar that looks to help others. We want to protect our clients, we want to protect the profession, but we want to protect each other as well. And so we save lives and we save careers. So I went to visit that lady the next day, and by the following Tuesday, I was off at summer camp. It was the meeting occurred the week before Memorial Day, and so the process took that week. And by the following Monday, the arrangements had all been made, and on Tuesday morning, my younger son drove me to a place on Cape Cod. I don't know geographically, but that is a famous vacation place in the state of Massachusetts. And I love that fact just because I can call it going on vacation. And I only spent 2 weeks there, but it was probably 2 of the most important weeks of my life. I was introduced to our program. It was a place that was based on the 12 steps. And I came back to Boston 2 weeks later with a list of things that I was supposed to do. I was supposed to find a home group. I was supposed to find a big book group. I was supposed to find a men's group. I was supposed to go to a meeting every day. And I had a list of opportunities. And I spent that week going to different parts of the city the day before each meeting I was supposed to find it. And I determined to take the same type A approach that had made me a success as a lawyer and apply it to the business of getting sober. And it was one of these things. It was sort of, if this shit doesn't work, it's not going to be my fault. And and I use that to this day with the new men that I work with. And why don't you think you can do this yourself? Why don't you take that special will of yours and apply it to doing what we do and see whether that works as well. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity and has changed my life. From having gone into office proposing that somehow I was going to get through my year as president of the bar without embarrassing myself. And by the way, becoming the embarrassment of one of the only Black lawyers who were president of a major metropolitan bar association. So there was a lot of stuff tied up in there. I have to say, and I'll say it now because sometimes it comes up at a different time in this tale, but one of the things that happened to me when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous is you not only ruined my drinking, but you ruined my minority status. I came here and I heard people who were just like me. I heard people with the same doubts and insecurities that I had attributed to being a member of the underclass, of being a member of a racial minority, of being an outsider, of being someone who was being put upon because of his race. And I found these people who had the same emotions and feelings, shared them, which of course I never would have done. And I think many of us would never have done until we came into these halls and found people with whom we could be comfortable. I ended up in 1997 speaking at a meeting of a thing called the International Lawyers in AA in Washington, D.C. And I ended up speaking there because at one of those AA meetings at the Bar Association that I had been at, I had made a comment as I was speaking of having grown up as though we were living behind enemy lines. And it was just too catchy a statement for people to leave alone. And so they invited me to speak at this as the dessert speaker at one of their meetings. And that got me involved in that group that Stephen and I have spent so many years working for the benefit of other lawyers. I got done with my 2 weeks in Cape Cod. I came back to town. I served as the president of the Bar Association. I had an extraordinary year. It was the highlight of my career. I found that people would listen to me, would do for me. People who came to the bar wanted to help others, while at the same time I proceeded on other avenues to become active in the lawyers' recovery movement. It gave me the opportunity to give back, and it gave me the opportunity to be involved with people like Stephen. And Stephen introduced me sort of not only to the Serenity Improvement Group, but he also pointed me at a men's group that meets in Buffalo, New York, that has got a whole bunch of the guys that participate in that program. And I think some of them now drop in here at this meeting, and I see some smiling faces on the Zoom. And I found some men that I can share with. My men's group got sort of semi-suspended when the pandemic came. And so I found a place where grown men could talk about things that bothered them, a condition which I did not know existed in life. Another wonderful side effect of finding that I was an alcoholic. I continued to succeed. I did better. If you were to look at me from any lens other than the insiders, it looks like I didn't miss a beat. Promotions, opportunities, successes continued. So much so that in the very beginning of my sobriety, I thought I had just nipped this thing in the bud. I had just snatched myself from the cliff's edge um, at the last minute before I really had a problem with alcohol. But I read the book and I found me all over it. And I found all of the things. It was great. It was great to read this book and see that they knew who I was and they had solved the problem that I had. So I went on with that. I'd like to go beyond that. In about five years into sobriety, I was off in Atlanta, Georgia, at a meeting, another bar association meeting, and my wife of 25 years was with me, and we had dinner one evening, and I had gotten a book of meetings, and I said, "There's a meeting over in the Black community tonight at 7:30, and if we get done with dinner early, I think I might go to it." And she said, "Oh, that'd be great. That'd be good." And I said, "Okay." So we got done with dinner, and I think I had to grab a cab, and I went over to this meeting, and it was in a meeting room at a community center next to a public housing center. And it was an all-black meeting. It was the first all-black meeting I'd ever been in. And to be honest, I had probably the greatest knowledgeability about the program of anybody in the room, just because of where I'd studied, as it were. I'd gone to Harvard, as it were, for my AA training. And I had a wonderful time. And we shared, and they told me about other meetings, and I was on my way. And I went back to the hotel and got back to the room. Closed the door to the room, and my wife said, "How was the meeting?" And I said, blah, blah, blah. Basically, I blew off her question. We weren't in the habit of talking about what went on at meetings, and I'm a lawyer after all, and I don't talk about things unless it's really called for. And she said, no, I really wanted to hear. And I said, "Oh, I don't want to compete with the TV," which was running in the background. And she shut the TV off. And there I was with this woman who I'd been married to for 30 years and required to speak to. It was like there was no out. And so I started to tell her about the meeting, and we had a lovely conversation. And then over the course of the next week that we spent in Atlanta, things would come up from time to time. And I would explain them to her. And things that had gone on in my life. Sometimes I'd be in a situation where to try and explain something, I have to go 2 stories back because I'd been so closed mouth about my life that in order for her to understand something I was saying, I had to fill her in on the background. I'd viewed into information as weapons, and that if you didn't know something, you couldn't hurt me with it. I tell the story, and it goes to the results of that week in Atlanta. I got back to Boston, and I told my sponsor about it. I said, "I don't know what the hell happened. We've been talking about me for a week, and I'm answering the questions, and I'm open to this." And we talked about it, and it turns out, I just finished a 4th run through the steps, had done a new 4th step and 5th step, and I'd learned a lot more about myself. And amongst other things, I had learned that despite my vaulted willpower and my type A personality and my strong ethical base and all that other stuff, I had gone through 4 4 steps with essentially the same defects of character. That my so-called efforts, I looked at this thing like, okay, you go out and you make up a punch list of the things that were left to be done. You consult with your general contractor, your sponsor, and you set about getting them fixed. And that last 4-step then told me, you're not getting this job done. And that may have been the first time I actually started to turn things over. I said earlier, I couldn't stop drinking till I couldn't stop drinking. Well, I couldn't ask for help until I realized that I couldn't do it myself. And I had lived a life of doing it myself. Anytime I didn't get something done, I would use that old debater's trick of it's not over yet. The game isn't done. I'll still get it done. We'll postpone the grades. But in any event, whatever that was, after having drunk at my wife for probably the last 15 years of our marriage before I got sober, I had gotten sober at her for 5. I was basically keeping her at arm's length. You can tell it affects me when I go back there to think about that and think about it ain't easy. It doesn't always happen. And it takes work on my part to open up. But I did some notes and I said, closed up, opened up. And I had finally opened up and started to talk. I still don't feel. I had been waiting for her to get well. I had been waiting for her. I don't know whether I was waiting for her to go to Al-Anon, something which I feared, and which is yet to happen. But I was waiting for her. I am fixing myself. When are you going to fix yourself? And somehow I walked out of that process and said, no, I just got to go ahead. I have to take the leap of faith. I have to stop trying to hide. I have to stop covering up. I have to stop not sharing because I'm afraid. And so I called it a leap of faith in the sort of colloquial sense that we say that all the time. But I think it was a true leap of faith. There was another time that the grace of God presented itself in my life. We've had a hell of a different life since that time. It ain't perfect. None of it's been perfect. We've been married for 53 years. I think you'll find that people that got married when we got married, there are more of us with 53 years than the average. Somehow it sticks. And we got married to stay married, and that saved our lives in many ways. And in 2018, the decision was made that she needed to have some valves fixed on her heart. And so she underwent open heart surgery. And I was in crisis for a month or so that led up to that. And our son, our older child is a doctor, and they sent me home from the hospital the day of the surgery without even starting to bring her back to life. And I put my head on a pillow in our bed, which I had never done before. I had spent a lot of time in hotel rooms on the road and moving around, but not a lot of time at home alone. And I don't know what made me wake up and why I hadn't done it before. I called my son. And fortunately, they live on the West Coast. And I told him what was going on. And his very manner put me at ease. And he said, yeah, they do that a lot. They don't bring people, and he told me clinically what was going on. And then this product of our union said to me, Dad, you're just where you're supposed to be. We say that a lot to our sponsees, and I kind of think of it as something that we do. And here was a man with no exposure to this thing. Here was the product of our marriage telling me I was going to be okay, and that I was just where I was supposed to be. If you ever had a doubt about the presence of a higher power or comfort to persons in crisis, it was over for me. It was, I was okay. Aside from the support from my son on that phone call, the support I received from my fellow members of this club was always there. And it gave me great comfort. Well, that young doctor, not very young, who told me that I was going to be okay, has since presented us with twin girls and a little sister. And we're in our 70s, the second half of those 70s. So having 6-year-old twins is a little bit of work. But I look at my wife with her granddaughters. And we had a moment at a pool in Orlando 3 weeks ago where we were down at the pool. We were not at a theme park that day. And I looked at them across the pool. My son was standing next to me. And I just said, what a gift you've given your mother. And he lit up. His very body indicated the joy he took in having heard me say that. And I realized I needed to go back and tell him, me too, but I didn't. I just let it go. I said, that was good enough. Maybe he didn't hear that I didn't say us, but I said her. But it was fine. And I haven't run the clock out entirely, but I got to say I'm a happy man. I'm still struggling with how we deal with these old ages. What do we do? How do we operate? I still got enough to do on a daily basis. I'm still on the road, spending time, hopefully trying to help other people. So right now, I still am actively engaged. I haven't figured out the end game, but I also have figured out that I don't have to figure out that end game. So I'm happy. I'm glad to be here and have this opportunity to share with you all. And I want to thank you for being here and helping to keep me sober. And Stephen, I think that's a wrap.